a little bit different. My picture is no longer in the bottom right. Loom, which is what I record or use to record these tutorials, is down. So we're just going to go with the classic Mac recording tools. Last section or video, we spent a lot of time installing things. We set up Postgres. We defined the settings for that. We ran migrations. We set up environment files, and then we also saved our package versions in a file. And we've been doing a lot of configuration. We've been running things in the terminal and we've been installing things, and it's kind of boring. So for this video, we're going to dive into a bit more of the Django code. We're going to write some code. We're going to maybe write some Python code as well. And we'll make some things, do all the cool, fun stuff that you can do with Django. So to start, make sure in your terminal you have your environment activated. I'm just going to reactivate mine even though it's done. And then if we go back to the code, let's take a look at this again. So we have our Django project, and we have, if you created two apps, you're going to have example and users or something else. Let's use the example one or whatever one you're using for now, just to once again create examples, and then I'm going to use the users one later on for my real stuff. But the way this works, and if you'd like to follow a tutorial getting started, the Django getting started tutorial also dives into models. Models are what we use to define database tables and what fields they have and all that stuff. So let's just go look at that part real quick. Database setup, yada, 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 yada. Here we are. So this is how you define a model in Django. So it's a class, and then you're inheriting the model class, so you get a bunch of fun functionality with that. And then you're just defining fields. So instead of questions, let's do our own to make the brain churn a little bit. So you might have a school, and that is a model class. I got that right? Okay. And then within here, a school has a name, and Django provides a bunch of different fields. So name is going to be a character field, and some of these require different parameters. This one requires a max length. So we're going to say names can be only 120 characters, which is pretty outrageous, but just ignore the application of that. The school might have an address as well, and I'm not going to add an address because then you're sort of like, do you store addresses as a string? Do you store them as a separate database table? Do you store them as something else? But school could have name, and let's just stop there actually. There's a bunch of other things you can add to models, and I'm not going to dive. I might add a couple of them. Let's see what it recommends. Yeah, I'm just going to skip it for now because there are so many other kind of predefined methods. One of them is the string method you can see here. If you go back here, the string method is what is printed when you print an object. So let's say at some point in the future, if you're used to variables, you might have a number equals 1, and then you might have a whole school, and it actually is a type of, like it's a whole school object. And if you print, let's see, a whole school object. So a whole school object isn't anything, but if it was a school and you ran print a number, you'd get 1. If you run print a school, you get whatever this method returns. And that's not just Django. That's, I believe, just kind of Python as a whole. You can have a string method on a class. Anyway, so we have this model, and now, like, what do we do with this? And the first thing we need to do is we need this to be defined on our database. So if we go back here and we, what's the command? Is that it? Yeah. PSQL Postgres. So that's using the Postgres database, entering PSQL. So you want to connect to your database, whatever you named it. I named mine example. I'm running clear because I'm so used to it. It doesn't do anything. And if we list our database tables, you see we have all these tables that we created in the past, but we don't have that new school table. So how are we supposed to store data? So if I exit out of here, and if you remember, you can run the Python manage.py make migrations command. And what this does, you need to be in the project that you're working in, like in the Django project. Make migrations. No changes detected. Did I save the file? Let's see. I did. Am I tripping? Oh, we completely missed a step. When you create new apps, so example and users are apps within our application, you need to define those apps in your settings so the project knows that they're being used, right? So if I'm not mistaken, I think I can just put example here and users. Now we have two apps within our project. And now if we run make migrations, it's going to try and run the migrations for our apps. As you can see here, migrations for the app example are run. Here's the new migration file, and it did this. Let's go take a look. So go to our example app, migrations folder, there's a new migration. And these can be more complicated, or obviously can be more complicated than this. But in our operations, we have one operation. The migration is going to create a model, so create a whole table. There's the name, and here are the fields. And now if we go back to Postgres, and we run pcable Postgres, and we connect to our database, or connect to your database, however it works on your computer, and we list our tables, we're still not seeing our school app. So what's going on? So let's exit. Oh no, I created a new window. All right. So what's going on? Like I mentioned in the past, migration files, these files we have here, they're just records of how a database has changed over time, but you need to run these migration files on a database. So if we go back to our terminal and we run migrate, what this does is it takes those files and it says, like, run these modifications on the database. So you can see there, it ran. Go back into your database, connect to your database, your database. And if we list the tables now, we now have an example underscore school. So the app underscore the model. And we could even probably insert data here if we wanted to. But let's do that through functionality that Django provides. Okay. So now let's try and add a school into our database. The easiest way to do this when you're starting off with a Django application is to use the Django admin panel, which they provide. So let's run a few commands and then I'll explain what that is and how it works. To start, run the Python manage.py create superuser command. What this does is it creates a superuser for your application because Django built-in already has a user object that you can use. So I'm going to just create a username Joe. I'm going to make a fake email here because we won't be sending emails anytime soon. And then put in a password. It doesn't have to be too complicated because this is just a local project. So there we go. Superuser created successfully. And the next thing you want to do is you want to run your application, which is running there. You can see it's running on this address. So if you go here, there we are. And by default, if I'm not mistaken, you can just type /admin in the URL and you will be brought to the Django admin panel, where you can put in the username you just created with your password, and you are brought into your Django admin panel. By default, they have a couple of tables here. They have groups, which is used for permissions at some point, and then users. We created our super user, so this is showing up. This is a row in our database, but we want to see schools as well. And to do that, we need to tell Django, hey, we just made a model, now put it in your admin panel. And I don't remember how to do this by default, so I hope, let's see. Yeah, they're doing it right here. Here we are. So once again, that 5-step tutorial, or even just the first 3 steps of the 5-step tutorial, are amazing for learning Django at the start. But what we need to do is we have our admin panel functionality. We want to import our model that we created at school. So .models is in this folder. There's a in this folder there's a models file. I sometimes like to be explicit and say in the example app models file. And then you just want to register that with the admin side. So if we go back, a few changes were run here. It redeployed or ran the app. And there we are. In our example app, we now have a schools thing here. And if we click add school, we can say a high school, click save, and we now have a school in our database. Okay, let's take a pause. That was a lot. So we've created a model, we've run the migration, so that model has been created in our database, and now we are using the admin panel to add data. You can also use it to modify data, you can use it to search data, you can do all these fun things. And you'll find a lot of people in the real world, they do use the Django admin panel as an application. Like you could define some models and continue adding things and just send this to a client, give them a user, and they could manage data. And you will find examples like that. We're not going to do that because sometimes you want some more advanced functionality. Sometimes you just want to use a front-end framework because it's cool and you want to be hip. But the admin panel is still extremely useful as a tool to create data, look at your data, debug problems, or to just manage an application. So as a developer in the distant future, you could launch an app, create a super user for yourself, so you're the only super user, and then log into the admin panel and view production data and see what's going on, maybe find some issues, and all sorts of things. That's how we're going to set up this project. Is the admin panel is going to be something for you, the developer, to use to look at data and do things with data. So keep that in mind. And with that being said, kind of the next step in this whole tutorial process is, hey, now we have a high school. Can we get that high school to show up in a React app? And we have a few steps to get there. So to start, by default, Django, when you use it, it's this probably might not be the right term, but it's a templating language. So you make a request to a URL, we make a request to, /admin. It runs some Python code, and then it actually creates the HTML and serves the HTML itself with CSS and all that fun stuff. But how we're going to use Django is actually as an API or a REST API. And in that sense, when you hit an endpoint such as /admin or later on /users, which doesn't exist yet, it would return JSON data to your React app, so your React app can display that JSON data. So let's start moving toward that. Now, the best way to do that with a Django application, and perhaps the only way really, is to use the Django REST framework, which takes a Django application and turns it into an API. So requirements, there's a few here. We can just follow along. Let's install Markdown support for the browsable API, filtering support. I think we want all that. Let's install all of it. So I'm going to stop the app, clear this. We're going to install Django REST framework. Awesome. We're going to install Markdown, which gives Markdown support for the browsable API. I have no idea what that means, if I'm honest, but we're going to figure it out. So install Markdown and Django filters, which is absolutely useful. Allows you to filter data with a variety of classes and tools and all that fun stuff. So there we are. We've installed it. We need to add this. This is an app. So just like our example app and our users app, this is an app that we need to define in our project. So I'm just going to put this right here. It's nice to add little spaces between sections. So maybe this is the installed apps. This is your apps, installed apps, and Django apps. if you're intending to use the browsable API, you probably want to also add REST framework's login and logup views. Add the following to your root URLs. Let's do it and see what happens. Learning on the fly here. So let's start root URLs. Beep, boop, beep. And that was everything. So let's rerun our application. Let's go to the URL, see what happens. Uh-oh, include is not defined. I gotta assume that's the right one. Okay, so we added that fix. Server's running. Now if we go back to our app, oops, that's okay. API stash off. So now if we go to our app, we just have 8,000 API dash off with an appending slash. And let's add it with an appending slash. Oh, oops. I've never used this before. I wonder if we can log in with the user we created. Interesting. Okay, we might not need that. It probably has some pretty, we're gonna leave it installed because it might have some, I might learn something and we might be able to use it later on to browse our API, and that's what it sounds like it does. So let's leave that. And now they offer a bunch of sort of examples on how you can set up endpoints. Let's just follow this to a T. So one thing is with the Django REST framework, you can set up a bunch of kind of defaults about how your API works. You know, like, do you need to be authenticated by default to browse URLs? By default, can you order data? By default, can you filter data? By default, all of these things. And most, if not all of them, are going to be defined in this REST framework setting that I just copied and pasted and lost. So default permission classes, like I said, by default, all endpoints use the model permissions, which is something built in Django, or anonymous can read only, which is great. So let's use that. Make sure you save that. Gonna close this file. Now, let's do what they did sort of naively and just copy this section of code and go back to the URLs where they've imported it right here. So instead of, oh, I see they're using their built-in model. So instead of this, remove the user model from our app, the example app, our models file, we want to import our school model. And then from there, hyperlink model serializer. I haven't used this before. I know it's pretty useful, or it can be useful, but just keep it simple and do model serializer. So we're going to create a new class called school serializer instead. The model is going to be a school because this is a model serializer. It needs a model. And the only field on school is name. So like they say, serializers define the API representation. So if you have a school object, when your JSON is returned, what does the JSON look like? That's what a serializer does. And viewsets define the view behavior. So that's what happens. That's like the functional logic that happens when you request data. So what data can you see? How is it filtered? Do all the things and then serialize it with this format before the user sees it. So this is going to be a school view set. The query set, I think, is a required parameter, or you can use a method. By default, you're going to be able to see all the schools. And the serializer class is defining, like, once again, the format of the data you're seeing. And then defining a router, register the school's endpoint with this view set, and this automatically creates like two different endpoints with 6 different like HTTP methods. So like post, put, patch, delete, options, get one, fetch, etc. Blah, 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 blah. And here we are. So I think we could have put this in the app, but we'll move it afterwards. So this is taking that router and defining it right here. And let's see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen, to be honest. So the server's still running. If we just go to /schools, what happens? There we are, actually. So anonymous users have read-only, like our default permission said. And this is what our JSON response is going to look like. If you get schools, you're going to 200. These are the methods allowed on the endpoint. It's a JSON response. And the response is a list of schools where each school has a name and just the name of our school. So there we go. I think we're going to stop there for this tutorial, but we're getting somewhere now. We're writing code. We have schools in our database. This is going to be we're going to put a pause on the Django functionality now, and we're going to go into React. So we're going to, in the next video, we're going to get React all set up, and then we're going to see how fast we can make a request to our API that we have just created. This is an API. Like what you've done, you've built an API. Congratulations. Let's take a little pause there. But we're going to see if we can take React, set up a project, make a request to our API, and get those schools to show up in our React app instead of the Django admin panel or Django REST framework, API browser, or whatever. So yeah, great job, and I'll catch you on the next video.